Okay, so what we're doing now is we're going to get the panelists discuss amongst themselves. It's going to be an open internal discussion. We lost quite a bit of time. We'll try to go 20 minutes and see how it goes. But then I want to bring in our two discussants and just add you two to the discussion. And we'll hopefully have a good fire started. And then we will bring in you as the audience for the final 15 minutes or so of that open discussion. So I'm not sure how you want to proceed. I have questions as well. In fact, let me just give you some thoughts that came to mind. It seems that Hamza, that the argument you gave there is trying to undercut the atheistic project, and I've heard this sort of argument before. In fact, I'm working on things similar, not even in a theological setting. But you're talking about the what would you call it?
Evolutionary argument against naturalism.
Yeah, that's Plantinga's form, but this is not the same. Yeah.
That's the name I was looking for. Which is the idea that naturalism is self-defeating. But there's something quite interesting there. And I'm wrestling with this as an ethicist as well. What is grounding ethics?
Yes.
So I'm trained in the Western analytic tradition. And I'm trying to figure out, okay, why are these moves being made? And my sense is that the specific moves that are being made in, say, deontology and consequentialism,
yes.
They've been made because, let's say, the old way, the religious way of grounding ethics has been jettisoned. And now there needs to be a new starting point. And what you're suggesting is that starting point would be based on faith either way. But you're suggesting that this basis has, first it has let's say, centuries of religious grounding to it, whereas the new attempt to ground post-religion, post-death of God, has an arbitrariness to it that needs to be recognized. I hope I don't misrepresent what you're saying, but I find that quite intriguing because I'm not sure what resources there might be to grapple with what you're saying without accepting the ontology underwriting what you're saying. And this is not just a problem for today's discussion; it's a problem for philosophy in general.
Of course, yeah.
There's a problem of different ontologies competing with each other, and this is actually something for all of you. One of my I would say concerns coming into the room, that we recognize that there are different ontologies in this room, different cosmologies, right? I hope that I'm multilingual in the sense that I understand ontology underwriting your views, and I can understand ontology underwriting your views. But I think as a first step, we first have to realize that there are these different ontologies.
Can I just retort here, because you spent 3 minutes making that point, and we've got 25 minutes for this segment. And I just want to say that when you're talking about morality, and you're talking about Sharia law and all these kinds of things, you mentioned something quite interesting. You said, our ordinary requirements for moral philosophy. You mentioned as well, like you've got deontological ethics, you've got consequentialism or teleological ethics, and then you've got virtue ethics. Yes. You pick up a book on ethics, like for example John Mackey, you're going to find this kind of classification. This is a Western classification. You mentioned two men, which are Immanuel Kant and John Rawls, both of which, in a sense, represent the white liberal tradition, both white men from the Western Hemisphere. My question is, why should it be that white men dictate to us what morality is? Have we had enough of this in this country, in a sense that, this is now, to be honest with you, in a veiled sense. If you said our requirements for morality as if we've all subscribed to it, we have a completely different understanding and a completely different ontology. Why have you assumed that the white man is right? What proof that you have that is Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, or his hypothetical imperative, or John Rawls' veil of ignorance, what you kept mentioning, any of that stuff is true? And what proof do you have that it's objectively true as an atheist? If we can get through this question, then we can talk about Sharia law and the false things that you were saying about it. For example, a woman that's menstruating gets burnt or something like that, or you get burnt by it, or if you have sex with the one that's menstruating, which is not mentioned in any book of fiqh in Islam whatsoever. And you mentioned it's mentioned in books of fiqh, it's not mentioned in any book whatsoever. Then you mentioned Khomeini, who was an obscure figure. So my question is, as an atheist, you have the audacity to say our requirements of moral philosophy, as if the white man's moral philosophy is all of our moral philosophies. No, we have divine command theory, we have Quran, we have Sunnah, we have our own way of deriving morals. What objective proof do you two have that the deontological ethics of Immanuel Kant and or the veil of ignorance of John Rawls, who's a liberal, both of them are liberal in a sense, and or any of the consequentialist ethics of any of the utilitarian thinkers of the modern day is objectively true?
So first of all, I think you play a very dangerous game when you attach secular ethics to race, and you rob people who are of many races of their human rights.
Like
when
who?
you say that it's a white man's game to talk about rights,
No, I
or
didn't say
to
that.
try and abolish suffering.
No, I didn't say it's a white man's race. It's a white man's game to talk about rights. I said that what you've mentioned is a Western form of ethics. Is the ones who the knowledge producers were objectively white men, objectively from the liberal tradition in Europe.
You'll know about the genetic fallacy.
I'm not saying it's
In other words-
false. I'm asking you why it's true.
Yes. So let's first,
Go
I
ahead.
just first of all want to deal with this question of him saying we can assess the content of the ideas by looking at the race and the sex of the speakers.
You said our moral philosophy. You've included me in your morality. I'm asking you to prove your morality before you say our. I don't subscribe to your morality. Answer me why is the veil of ignorance of John Rawls or the consequentialist moralities of any of the liberal thinkers or the veil of ignorance or the deontological ethics of Kant is true.
I'll get to it. You're going to have to stop interrupting me
Yeah.
though. Okay.
And,
so
and
firstly,
just to add to you, so
Sure.
it enhances your discourse, you also mentioned rights.
Yes.
If you don't mind, I'm assuming you're advocating a liberal conception of rights, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
well,
Do you advocate the UN Charter?
the claim that I've made is that there are three different ways in which an atheist can construct morality. They
Yeah,
can
I
either-
understood that. I just
Yeah.
want to know specific, because you mentioned rights twice.
Yeah.
And it's very
So
important
a
to unpack
deontological
these.
account can get you rights, and a consequentialist account can also get you rights. So
Yes,
the rules of
but
determinism,
from the
for example.
perspective of law, of legal and moral reasoning, and what your views are, so I understand how to deal
Yeah.
with you
Yeah.
and your beliefs in a positive way. What conception of rights do you advocate? Is it the conception of rights that is known as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights?
So first of all, I haven't expressed the personal view about ethics, and I don't intend on doing that.
Okay, you mentioned rights twice.
You just say
if
our
you-
ordinary
could you
rights.
say-
Very nice, if I could-
Yeah.
No,
Yeah,
because
let's just-
the reason I'm saying
Martin
is because
just
rights are
finished.
connected to morality.
You've asked him a number of questions. Can you just, for the sake of discussion,
I
just
promise
give him,
not to
just give him
interrupt
5
you.
minutes?
Give him at least
I just wanted to.
a minute.
I do apologize. I just wanted to add to that because that's going to be a follow-up question. So if you think about that, just let us know.
Yeah.
Because what I wanted to say was that has a liberal individualist assumption, which many people don't have to agree. And that's why when you come to the table with these universals, it does come across in some way that there's a sign of maybe superiority complex.
Yes, superiority.
And I don't mean it in a negative way. I'm just trying to psychoanalyze certain statements in a positive way so we know and you could stand in the possibility that in actual fact that you may think you're already right. And I want you to stand in the possibility that you might be wrong. And if that's the case, then maybe define your terms a bit more clearer, especially when you're mentioning things like rights. Because rights is a big term, but it has ideological strong constructs. That's my
Yes.
point.
All right, so I'm now
That's
going to
it.
speak without interruption.
Absolutely.
And I'm going to try and answer your questions as best
Please,
as I
please,
can.
please.
You're still interrupting me.
I said
Okay.
please.
So, all right, let's first of all talk about the different moral frameworks that you can have. I haven't picked a lane for myself, and I don't intend on doing so. The claim that I have made is that an atheist is entitled to claim that there are moral facts, that they don't have to buy the nihilism. You've set up a false dilemma, which is to say that either morality is grounded in God, or there is no such thing as morality, that the atheist is required to say that they're just whizzing atoms and they cannot have any normative force. And what I pointed out is that there are very good secular claims to why there is morality, either grounded in suffering or grounded in human reason, which can generate rights. And by the way, those rights can be spoken about either in legal instruments, so we can talk about rights that are allocated by the UN, or they can just be talked about in the deontological sense. You don't necessarily have to think that the UN Charter on Human Rights is the definitive account. But I think we think a lot of the rights that are in the Charter are pretty good. Now, you can bite the bullet. You can just say, I don't buy any of it. I don't believe in rights. I don't think there's a problem with suffering. I don't like any of the rules that rules generates. And you can just bite the bullet and you can say, there is nothing wrong with putting homosexuals to death. That's just your white, liberal, Western conception of things. And then we're going to have to agree to disagree on that. The point is that you have to bite a very repugnant bullet. That when you deny the major moral theories, that the consensus is going to be against you. Now, it has nothing to do with your race or your sex. While I was trying to explain this, that there's a huge danger in claiming that the liberal tradition or that the moral philosophies that have emanated from John Stuart Mill, John Rawls, or Immanuel Kant belong to white people, or because they emanate from white people, there's something wrong with them. First of all, many people around the world benefit from the notion of human rights. The idea that as an individual, you have a claim against someone else not to do certain things to you. That because you have a right to dignity, it is wrong for someone to intentionally torture you against your will, to put you into a state of slavery. I mean, one of the examples that I gave where I said any person who thinks that morality is external and a good thing would think that slavery is abhorrent. Now, the Quran mentions slavery on many occasions. It does not.
Before we get to that,
it.
you've spoken for 2 minutes. Can we respond to one thing at a time? Because otherwise you're just going
Sure,
to go.
Let him finish that.
Let me finish that point.
Okay, go
Then
ahead.
we go.
If the Quran mentions slavery, and we'd expect the divine being that either issues good commands or is aware of what is good, to not just have regulation about slavery, but to outright condemn it, to say that no matter the society that you're in, regardless of the place or the time, slavery is always wrong. And we just don't see that in the Quran, and that seems
so
like a failure.
Let's responding. You've completely miscategorized what he said. You've strawmanned actually what he said, which is very surprising considering your level of qualification and education. I'm actually surprised that he didn't say we don't believe in rights or suffering. He said we don't believe in that you can't prove it objectively. Underline the word objectively. As an atheist, there is no mechanism through which you can prove deontological ethics or consequentialist ethics on an objective framework, which is why John Stuart Mill tried to prove the desirability principle in his book on utilitarianism. What I'm saying is that this is the first thing you're going to have to choose. The second thing is, we talk about race and you talk about slavery. Let me tell you something the Prophet Muhammad said. Okay, the Prophet said there's no virtue over a black man over a white man or an Arab over a non-Arab. How comes it took you, I don't know how many years as the white dominance to figure that out? Only 30 years ago you stopped apartheid. So why should we listen to you? In a sense, okay, you're playing the moral superiority card. With all due respect, it took you 1,300 years after the fact to realize that something the Prophet said, Prophet Muhammad, who you're attacking the religion of right now, 1,300 years before, you now agree with him. So how do we know you're not going to differ on these issues? Number two, on the issue of slavery, okay, because when was the apartheid end? 1994, 30 years ago, and they're telling us about this and that. I mean, I don't see how this is working here. Number two, you said this, the emanation and the knowledge production of these ideologies that you're talking about is undoubtedly white and European. You cannot take that away from the reality. I don't think John Stuart Mill or Jeremy Bentham or Immanuel Kant was Nigerian. I didn't see. You're talking about secular ethics. It's not the secular ethics of the black man, is it? It's the secular ethics of the white man. And you've already assumed it to be true, just like many of probably the people before in this country, white men, assumed that apartheid was true. Then they had to, the suffering, by the way, that Mandela and others had to undergo, the suffering, which is good suffering, by the way, because not all suffering is bad. You said suffering is bad. What about the suffering that Mandela and the others, the anti-apartheid activists, had to go through? Was that good suffering or bad suffering? It was good suffering, because then people realized that it's equality and race and things like that. So this is what you're doing here, is you're being morally sanctimonious. You're clearly trying to come with a hierarchy, as you explained to me. No, you explained to me why your morality is true in the first place. I believe, yes, homosexuality is prohibited in Islam. It's wrong. Yes, I believe you're going to go to the hellfire if you don't believe in Allah. Yes, I believe that there's heaven. Yes, I believe in the day of judgment. These are things I believe in. Tell me why that's wrong. Tell me why that makes Islam to be true. What creedal disproving implications does that have? As a philosopher, where is your objective morality? Where is your objective reasoning? Where are the arguments? Where is the empiricism? Where is the calculations? Where is the proof? Where is the evidence? That's what I'm asking. Don't assume, because the dominance remains in the Western Hemisphere, and there's hegemony on the side of the Western Hemisphere, that whatever ideology they decide to put down, we're going to assume is going to be true, that you're going to come here and tell us our requirements our moral requirements. That's your moral requirements. You have a religion, I have a different religion. Prove to me that your religion is true. That's what I'm saying. Why is consequentialism true? Why is deontological ethics true? Why don't you come and start with that?
So before Mark response, I just want to make a meta comment about the style of communication that's going on, which makes me very uncomfortable.
Okay.
I'm very uncomfortable with how this has very quickly degenerated into a shouting match. I understood, and I was led to believe by the organisers of this event, that we were going to be here to discuss, in a mature and reflective way, various worldviews. I'm very disheartened by the turn that this has already taken. So I want that noted for everybody to see, because because I am not, as philosophers, as intellectuals, and for the last 5 minutes, Mark, he's an absolute gentleman, has been shouted at. Now,
this is not relevant, to be honest with you.
Right,
We're talking about God and morality. You've spoken for about 10 minutes about why Islam is false.
And again,
Can you get to the point, please?
and again, the point is I'm making a
Get to the point.
I'm making a meta point.
Yeah, but it's not really. It's not.
Okay, sorry, I'm gonna have to step in. So let me just reset. Let's reset things. Okay.
So I want to reset things, and I want to talk about something
Can I
that's
say
very
one
interesting
thing?
that came up.
I will let you. I promise I'll let you. So we did say that this is a discussion, and we all came here wanting to discuss things, and understand that things are heated. I should say that I enjoyed all 4 presentations. I was impressed with the level of philosophy in all 4. Sorry, I said 3. All 4 presentations, right? And I'd like us, as best as we can, even though these things are heated for all of us, to try to do what we did in the discussions. Try to argue the point, even if we do not like many
I don't
things
want anyone
about
to
it.
tell me how to speak. With all due respect, I'm free in this country. I can speak with an assertive voice. I don't need people telling me how to speak. I've not been told that I cannot speak in an assertive voice. A discussion doesn't exclude that. With all due respect, I don't want to be told off. This is a 25-minute segment, and we're
I'm not telling you off.
Yeah, no, he was for 2 minutes. That is a runaway tactic. He knows that he's got nothing to say about this issue. Respond to my argument. We came here talking about Prophet Muhammad and Salman Rushdie and homosexuality and attacking Islam. I'm telling you, respond to my arguments. Instead of trying to tell me off like a little boy, trust me, I'm not a little boy. In every single man, I'm a bigger man than why is it that your one is objectively true? Go and answer the question,
You
please.
have to write it down, sir. So sorry, sir. We haven't settled this yet. So the issue is not being told what to say or how to say it, right? The issue is that there's a
structural apartheid, the way you're being dealt with right now. That's what I'm telling you. I'm going to speak in the way I want to speak.
So
No one has told me I can't
let me
speak
say
in a
this.
certain
Let me
voice.
put it this way.
I would
right?
like to be dealt with properly here.
Let me put it this
You know
way.
what I'm saying? So just answer my questions. I don't want to be told how to speak. With all due respect,
Listen,
I don't come here for that.
I'm speaking to you in a way.
You're being sanctimonious and
Nope.
you're trying to be the schoolboy teacher.
Nope.
You're not here for that.
No. I actually.
It's why you spent 3 minutes actually in our panel discussion.
No. My views
That
are
wasn't
closer
agreed.
to
That wasn't
yours.
agreed.
I'm not an atheist.
Oh, it doesn't matter what you
My
are.
views are closer to yours. And I recognize
Stop this, please.
the issue.
Something to say.
So one of the discussants was to say something.
Could I ask, sorry, because you're the moderator of the show, can I ask if all of you agree that we can sense that Chad and I, it gives us a chance to think over things, and then we'll get back to our 4 panelists.
So do you want to ask a question?
And then I think as the discussants, but maybe Chad can say, we...
Are you going to come
yes,
in?
Yes.
Do you want to throw the white towel for him?
No.
Just throw it out.
Sorry.
Just throw it out.
Okay, I'm going to bring in. So I did promise Aaron that you're going to finish your point. Okay.
Yes.
So just
Yeah, I wanted
please
to,
do.
I wanted to actually, I came here to talk about philosophy. I've spent a long time preparing. I read Hamza's book and I wanted to talk about some interesting things. So perhaps we could do that.
Yes.
Please. So a number of your arguments, and Muhammad made this point about his contingency argument. There was this talk about this problem with actual infinities, which I think it's fascinating. There's a really interesting metaphysical discussion to be had about whether infinities can be instantiated in reality. I know, Hamza, Muhammad, you are okay with mathematical infinities. So you have no problems talking about in a logical space that mathematicians can talk about mathematical infinities, so the cardinalities of infinite sets, or potential infinites that tend towards infinity, like an asymptote. You just think that for some reason those can't be instantiated in reality. Is that a fair assessment of your view? That they can't be instantiated in reality?
Yeah, yes, to a degree.
Okay, so I want to put forward this argument for discussion.
Yes.
So it's an argument for atheism, and I'm just interested to get both your input on it.
But sorry, before you do this, we've asked a question. Like, with all due respect, I know this was a distraction, but I did ask a question and there was a distraction, so can you answer my question before I answer yours?
Yeah.
Tell you what, why don't we get back to that after he's given his...
Yeah,
his
I have no
point.
problem.
I'm very happy to respond.
We can talk about rights and the objective basis. I have no problem talking about that.
Okay, good. You said that. You're a man of your word.
Yeah, 100%. We'll talk. We can talk about that. We can talk about moral realism and all of that. Okay. So let's just assume X hypothesis that actual infinities can't exist, but they can exist in a conceptual realm of abstract logic and mathematics. Okay. So here's the problem. The problem you might have heard before is that this problem is how does that reconcile with God's infinity? Now I know, Hamza, you've said that there's a distinction between a qualitative infinite and a quantitative infinite.
Yes.
Right, so your normal response is when you're challenged on this about God's infinity being instantiated in reality, you say, no, that this is a qualitative infinite. There's no like separate thing of God that's infinite. It's a way of talking about his acme, all his good properties. This is the problem that I want to pose and see how you guys deal with it. Because I don't know, honestly, I don't think I've heard you respond to this.
Fine.
So the first premise is that God is essentially omniscient. Right? So I take that to be a fundamental feature of Islam. So if God is omniscient, then I take it that he has actual knowledge of all true propositions.
Mm-hmm.
So premise 3 of the argument is then that the cardinality of the set of natural numbers is aleph naught.
Mm-hmm.
Premise 4 is that there's a true proposition about each member or element of the set of natural numbers.
Mm-hmm.
From that we can conclude that therefore God has actual knowledge of aleph naught true propositions.
Yeah.
Having knowledge of a numerically distinct proposition P entails having a numerically distinct belief about proposition P.
Yes.
Therefore, God has numerically distinct beliefs about aleph naught true propositions.
Yeah.
A belief is an actually existing state of an actual mind.
Yeah.
So beliefs are not mathematical objects and they're not abstractions.
Yeah.
They might be about abstract objects and they might be about abstractions, but beliefs themselves are states of a mind, even a divine mind.
Yeah, sure.
Right. So therefore, God has an actual aleph naught, which is the cardinality of infinity, number of beliefs in mind. But if X hypothesis actual infinities are impossible by the assumption, then we must conclude that God is not omniscient. But if God is not omniscient, then he's not essentially omniscient. And if it's a defining feature of God's omniscience that he's essentially omniscient, then he doesn't exist.
Right.
So it seems to me that the problem, and maybe you will have to retract on the idea of that actual infinities can't exist. Or you'll have a different view about God's mind. Maybe.
No, I don't.
Okay, so that's the argument. So I just want to know what you guys think about
this.
that.
Has been dealt with extensively in the books of Kalam, actually.
Okay.
This actual question.
Yes, so let's hear it.
It's actually a good question.
Yes, I'm
actually.
interested.
So I'm going to answer you. Look, so the distinction between quantitative and qualitative has been made. Usually, it's a bog standard answer that's given by William Lane Craig himself.
Yes,
as well.
I've heard that.
Actually, it's connected to the Kalam cosmological argument.
Yes.
Now, the thing is, what is actually problematic about the idea of an actual infinity in the real world?
Yes.
So if you look, for example, at Avicenna's account, and it's interesting, there's a lot of secondary source materials and stuff like that, and other people's account as well, Ibn Taymiyyah being one of them. They don't have a problem with the instantiation of an actual infinity in the real world. They only have a problem with the actual instantiation of the real world considering certain conditions, and I'll tell you what they are.
Okay. Yeah.
So, number one, the condition is that these things they occupy a space-time. And number two is that they coexist. Okay? Number three is that they're limited. Now, let me tell you again, right? That they're limited, they occupy space-time, and that they actually exist.
Right.
So, for example, many scholars of philosophy of religion, Aristotle believed this, Ibn Sina believed this, Ibn Taymiyyah believed this, many people believe this, Ibn Qayyim believed this, that there was actually an infinite regress of things. They didn't see it as an absurd, or they didn't believe it was, they connected it with a necessary being. The major differentiation that they put in place was the following. Look at this bottle, for example. This is limited. Would you agree? It's limited in its form.
In certain properties.
Yes,
different
sure.
physical properties.
Sure.
Yes.
So,
it's got a particular arrangement of matter.
So what they would say is that this bottle, which is contingent and limited and dependent, having an infinite amount of these bottles at the same time, okay, that is what would be impossible. Why would that be impossible? Okay. Because number one, they're limited. Number two, they're contingent. And number three, that they would have to coexist at the same time. So with these conditions in mind, you see, they would discount the idea of an actual infinity. They would say an actual infinity in these contexts wouldn't work. With God now,
yes,
he's not limited. So this is already a difference. He's not contingent. So you see, God is necessary, a necessary being by definition must exist, but even the attributes of the necessary being, for example, for the omniscience, it must be necessary. Telazumi,
it's essential in any
sure. But which means
the
idea of a quantitative infinity is not only not applicable to him.
Yes.
It's not applicable to him. Number two, it's something which is not applicable to anything necessary. So in other words, you see, the actual infinity is in the context of limited things which coexist at the same time. and which are dependent and contingent. That's where the gripe is. It's not where the idea of as you phrased it, which is an actual infinity in the real world. That's why it's actually, we can believe an actual infinity in the real world only with the necessary existence. It's only an actual infinity in the real world with certain conditions which I just mentioned.
Yeah. No. Okay. So yeah. Snow, you wanted to go?
Yeah. So if you don't mind, so you said like the belief, God having a belief,
Yeah.
would mean that it's actualized in the real world.
No. What I'm
What were you saying?
What I'm
Just clarify,
So what I'm saying is that you believe that God is a mind, right?
No,
so
No, we don't.
God doesn't have beliefs. He doesn't have knowledge.
No, knowledge, yes.
Yeah, but there's
Is God? So maybe I'm confused. Maybe
Yeah,
is God a person?
so this will be
Is he an immaterial person
well,
or
this
not?
will this will be
it's
one
the
of
phraseology here.
yeah.
That's,
So
some would affirm that phraseology, some wouldn't. But
So just to so we believe in God's transcendence, right? So
Yeah.
using things like mind and person is something that doesn't really exist in our tradition, especially
shakhs doesn't have these.
yes.
Yeah.
A mind, yeah.
No, person.
A person, yeah. Sorry, with regards a person with a mind, yeah.
Right.
That has subtle anthropomorphic connotations.
Right.
So we wouldn't really fixate on the term mind itself, right?
Okay.
That's the first thing. This is why I want to find out what do you mean by God's beliefs and why are you saying
Yeah.
that this means that they are actualized. I want
Yeah,
to unpack that.
I'm happy to. So my general understanding, and maybe we are talking across purposes,
Yes.
because the idea that I've always had of the sort of being that resonates for people, that is cashed out religiously, is the idea that people have a belief that God's looking out for them. He's essentially he's a person, and we are made in His image. And obviously, God's not a finite person. Like I take it, you guys don't
He's
believe
transcendent.
that. Yeah, He's transcendent, unlimited, unbounded, necessary, all of those sorts of things.
With the word unlimited,
Yeah.
you have to connect it to an attribute of God, although because it's unintelligible.
Okay.
So if you say unlimited in mercy, unlimited in power, unlimited in knowledge.
Superlative, knowing no bound.
Yes.
So what I'm saying is that I've always understood that when people pray to God, He can answer prayers.
Yes.
God knows the amount of hairs that are on Hamza's head, on your head.
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
Even though I can't see what's on your head. But He knows what's going on with me and Mark, and these are distinct beliefs. And normally when we think about a justified true belief, we
Yeah.
just go with JTB
Yeah,
theory,
sure,
right?
sure.
Any claim of knowledge implies belief. Right? It's very hard to make sense of what you mean by God's omniscience if we're not talking about propositional knowledge.
Yeah, but my specific question is so I can know how to address your point
Yeah,
clearly.
yeah.
Because I don't want to straw man.
No,
you,
no,
understand
that's
you.
right.
So when you say God having a belief,
Yeah.
and then God having a belief means it's somehow actualized in the real world. What do you mean by
Oh,
that?
okay, so
and
let's
how
go that.
and how can
So-
you demonstrate
okay,
that God
so-
has a belief and by the very virtue he has a belief, it means it's actualized in the real world.
So when I say God's belief is real, I mean it in the same way that you think God is real.
No, but
God has. So in other words,
Yeah,
so
okay.
the,
Let-
do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Can I go back one step, right?
Yeah.
I know what you're trying to say. You're
Yeah.
trying to say, listen, you have a problem with actual infinities. You're saying that God's attribute of knowledge must be actually infinite because it's connected to quantifiable things which have to, for example, His own
Yeah.
self. Let me make it easier for yourself. If He's boundless, then He must know Himself, right? So in other words, He must have
It's not quite what I'm. It's not quite.
No,
what I'm saying.
I know, but you're saying
Yeah.
that you have a problem. You're saying to me, you have a problem with actual infinities, right? And God's knowledge, you're saying God's knowledge, you
It's
claim
actually
is actually
infinite.
infinite. So
Yes.
I'm responding to you. I don't have a problem with actual infinity. I'm responding. This is my response.
Yes.
I don't have a problem even in the real world. Listen to what I'm saying. I can see it's logically not always incoherent. Can you see? I'm not going KCH.
Yeah.
Because what you're doing now is you're refuting William Lane Craig's Calancho's logical argument. I'm saying I accept what you're saying here. It's
Yeah.
a strong point against the Calancho's logical argument. I grant you it. But what I'm saying is,
Yeah.
this is the response. Listen to what I'm saying, please.
Yeah.
You might want to write this down.
No,
with all due respect.
I'm listening.
Which is this. I'm saying I have a problem with actual infinities in the certain context. Number one, that the objects of in question in actual infinities, number one, are contingent. Number two, are limited. Number three, exist all at the same time. That's the thing that every scholar of the medieval
So can
period
you
says.
explain to me? So I'm trying to understand.
Yes,
what
okay,
you-
let me explain. Sorry, let me explain.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. So imagine God created A, then created B, then created C, and goes to infinity. That was Ibn Taymiyyah's view. That's a view in Islam. It's a view in Islam. Ibn
Right.
Sina believed this.
Right.
Many people believe this. Aristotle believed this. Do you see what I'm saying? It's a view in the philosophy of religion. I'm not saying logically it's fully problematic.
Yeah.
I'm saying the following: saying if you get all those infinities at the same time, all those things A, B, C ad infinitum, and put them all at the same time, the existence of those contingent, limited existences together, that's where the contradiction lies. Why? Because therein lies the absurdities of the part being more than the whole, that the inexhaustible becomes the exhausted, all those things that I mentioned in the presentation. That's where it would be a problem, where the spatial, temporal, time dimension is one, i.e. they all coexist. Yes, all those things exist at the same time, number one. And number two, that they're limited and contingent. Do you understand what I'm saying?
No, I think I understand what you're saying.
I would like to finish my point, which echoes. So it's a little bit of a straw man to consider the qualitative versus the. What did you say? I said in my book. I forgot now.
The qualitative and the distinction between qualitative and quantitative.
In the book, it actually goes a little bit further, and it echoes what Hijab is saying. Muhammad Hijab. It's more about the differentiated and undifferentiated infinite. This is the point. So it's based on temporal, spatial, discrete things, finite discrete things. So there is a fundamental difference. So we accept the actual infinite. We can accept it. But we don't accept it from the point of view that you can have an actual infinite that is based on differentiated things, which is based on the contingency, the limited nature. I want to refer to God. So you say God. So God's knowledge. No scholar on earth will say God's knowledge is a differentiated, eternal, limited attribute from the point of view that it's temporal, spatial, and it has these limitations. And that's why I wanted to really find out what you meant by belief and how that actually denies what we're saying. I can't see that the argument that you propose actually is a defeater in this context.
So before you could I'll let you finish your point. We're going to quickly bring in.
Of course.
We're going to quickly bring in Dr. Chad Harris, and then we can continue this with audience questions, perhaps on this point or other questions.
Well, he said he would answer my question.
I'm happy to. I don't mind.
Does he want to do that first?
On the human rights.
Yeah.
If you can manage that.
So do you want me to just rephrase the question? Reframe the question.
About the objectivity.
Yeah. How would you? Because you mentioned deontological ethics and you mentioned consequential, the veil of ignorance of John Rawls. I'm just saying, what is the ontological, epistemological grounding that this is a morality on an objective level? That's all. That's my question. Yeah.
So the view that I would give maybe is slightly different to Mark, although Mark did mention it.
Yeah.
Which is that I think that a good way to ground an objective ethics is to look at the nature of suffering. So when an entity suffers, one of the things that they learn about the suffering, the actual nature of it, is that it has an axiological valence. So in other words, we learn about the axiological disvalue of suffering through knowledge by acquaintance, through our direct acquaintance with the state of suffering. And I think that now we can cash that out in slightly different ways. I mean, some meta-ethicists will cash that out giving a reductive account. So some people will say, much like in the philosophy of mind, we want to reduce qualitative properties to neural states. Certain meta-ethicists think that it's appropriate to reduce suffering to the badness of suffering, the normative property, to sufferings. And I think that that's quite plausible. Another way of looking at it is to say that it's non-reductive. So in other words, that the normative property supervenes in a necessary way on the non-normative property of suffering. Another way is to look at it as a functionalist account. Now, all of those various accounts, they're very interesting in meta-ethics, but that's more an in-house debate amongst meta-ethicists. But once you grant that suffering is intrinsically bad, it may be instrumentally good in some cases, but once you grant that it's intrinsically bad, that generates a moral reason. Okay, so if you can just, I promise you I'm going to get there. So once we have a moral reason that's amenable to rational understanding, we can start to think about rights. Because once we recognize that there's an axiological disvalence or a negative axiological valence to suffering, we can see that entity has an interest, a moral interest in not suffering. And that has a rational claim to have a right. And what is a right? A right is a claim that an entity has to protect its vital interests. And one of the vital interests that it has is the interest in not suffering. Why? Because suffering is intrinsically bad.
Can I
so that's a way of generating.
This is the what someone will respond to that. Will say, listen, David Hume style. This is a is-or fallacy, it's naturalistic fallacy. Because what you're saying is suffering you feel is bad, therefore it is bad from an or-is or ought perspective, don't do perspective, teleological perspective, moral perspective. The point is, I don't even grant you the premise that suffering is bad in the first place. Some suffering is good. We all go to the gym and suffer there. Okay. Listen, let me tell you something. So, all due respect, I don't even grant you the premise. We suffer all the time. As I mentioned before, I gave you a live example.
Yeah.
The people that were the good people in South Africa that went against the apartheid for so many years, decades, I'm sure you're one of them, you're a rights activist yourself, were suffering against the hegemonic power until they achieved their achievement. So I don't even grant the idea that suffering is bad. Listen, hold on.
Okay.
The point is, you saying that suffering, you feel bad, therefore it is bad, is a naturalistic fallacy. David Hume, who's an atheist himself, said you shouldn't be doing this. That's not grounding objective morality. So now ask the question again. How can you ground objective morality on suffering? Go ahead, yeah.
So one response to that is you've conflated the intrinsic versus the non-intrinsic nature of suffering. So in axiological theory, there's two distinctions, important category distinctions that are often made. One is about the intrinsic nature of the intrinsic value of something. The other one is the non-intrinsic. What you are referring to is a non-intrinsic value of suffering. So suffering is qua suffering, qua mental state. The state of being in pain is itself bad in and of itself. It may be extrinsically good in the sense that it helps you to overcome certain things. Like, for example, I can see Hamza likes to train as well, as do I.
Really?
We like to train in gym, right? So the instrumental value of suffering, we can grant that, right? It's a non-intrinsic
No, I
value.
understand what you're saying.
What's the intrinsic value?
One more, just one more thing.
Yeah.
I think what you've done is conflated the psychological and the ethical. Like, for example, what you're saying is that we don't like pain. I agree with you, we don't like pain. Human beings don't like pain. Pain is bad, for the most part. I understand that. But what we're talking about here is a kind of psychological bad, not an ethical, teleological bad.
yeah,
I'm saying, how do you get from the psychological to the ethical? How are you making that jump?
There's another question I think would help this, because I would like to ask you, because I think you've slightly skipped something very important.
Go.
When we say objective, or when you say objective, what do you mean?
I mean,
Because if you ground moral values in a naturalistic paradigm, or you ground moral values in what you would say intrinsic suffering, for example, how does that make it objective? Because my understanding of objective is that irrespective of the whole world, right, if they were to say that, for example, apartheid is right, we would still know it is wrong. Because moral values are out there, so to speak. So they require an ontological grounding. You have to answer two key ontological questions of moral ontology.
Okay.
Number one, what is the source of this moral value? And what makes it mind independent? What you've done, actually, you've just gone round in circles.
So I've got a response to that.
You have it.
I've got a response.
But wait, one more, so you really understand what I'm trying to say, because this is philosophy, right?
No, we're doing
You
it.
said naturalism explains everything.
Yeah.
So under what naturalistic account? If naturalism is defined as, metaphysical naturalism is defined as, number one, there is no divine. There is no non-physical, and everything can be reduced to or explained by physical phenomena in some way. What you're doing, you're enchanting physical phenomena with some kind of divine attributes on non-physical features. So from that point of view, you'd have to also define what physical properties are, or what physical processes are, because from our understanding,
just a
they're
moment.
blind, cold, and non-rational.
Sorry.
So how can you? So
We have four gentlemen. Time is limited.
Oh, sorry.
And with this,
I wanna
you are
be thorough,
negating all these other people. There's a chair.
Why do you have to say this?
No, sorry.
Why do you have to say this? No,
I haven't
don't
spoken
say
that much.
No,
Can we give
Why do you have to always
everybody a
diminish?
round of applause so that
Why are you trying to acquiesce to them?
Sorry. I think you're out of order. I have to override my chair. I think you're out of order. If you're a Muslim and you speak about akhlaq, people
No,
could
please,
talk about
please.
character.
I think you are out of order. You're diminishing him.
No, I'm not
diminishing
diminishing him. I'm saying you're negating all these other people who
he's
want
not
to ask
negating anyone.
questions,
He's not negating
and you
anyone.
can have a discussion, and you will answer them. You cannot negate all these other people who also
negating
came to.
anyone.
I'm sorry that I'm overriding my chair. I'm being out of order by doing that. But I'm asking you to have some respect for others, and then we can speak about religion in totality. So can you let the chair do what he needs to do, and he will come back to and let you speak. But people here need to ask questions too. They can. Do not negate them.
We were having a
Because
Why
no,
come from England
but
to negate
for
them?
limited time. We have to think of
What
respect,
disrespect?
and you have limited
Can I
time.
make a meta point?
Let the
A
chair
moral meta
speak.
point?
Get
I
the
think
chair
it's important,
speak,
because I haven't
please.
spoken much, and we were having a very good
Can I
conversation.
let you
speak?
Yes, sorry.
make that point, and then I want to bring in discuss it. But I do want to thank you all for that very civil exchange. I really appreciate
We
it.
will. We'll have dinner.
Right, so direct help.
So the point I want to mention is because, look, I want to be as authentic as possible, which means I don't have any undeclared negative intentions. And I think I believe in sometimes of a collective consciousness, and energy permeates the room. And from the beginning, prior to this conversation, we had academics saying we need academics on the panel because in an academic university, because we have to academically, and it's not your words, but it came across, we have to academically babysit the panel. And I'm being honest, those were the words. We're here because we're academic, you need some academic professionals to give you an academic input. With all due respect, you have master's degrees, you have PhD, we're almost finishing, he has more degrees than a thermometer. So the point is, the point I'm trying to say is, I'm trying to, and this may be wrong, I stand in the possibility that I'm totally wrong, but I got the kind of feeling that there is almost a sense of, meta type of babysitting going on. And yes, there was emotions, but I think we're gentlemen. He knows, look,
He's a man.
let me tell you, 100% he knew what he was going to say was going to trigger someone.
Yeah,
I
100%.
guaranteed. We live in a hegemonic liberal secular society that's imposing on the Muslim community, and it's not a neutral space ideologically.
Security has just said that we need to wrap up. I'm saying
I get
to
you, but I'm trying to say that has to be clear because that's how it has come across from the beginning before we've entered this room, and we're having a really good philosophical discussion. And with due respect, the chair has already assessed that we're going to give more time to discussion than to Q&A. It was already agreed. With all due respect, you're subordinate in this conversation, and you should allow him to do his job. He interrupted, which was fine, but you didn't know why he interrupted. Let him interrupt properly. If he wanted to take it to the audience, that's fair enough. But with all due respect, let's not have any undeclared negative intentions. That we're all neutral and equal on this panel and platform. There is no, I'm academic, I'm up here, I need babysitting, you're this and the other. We're gentlemen, we have our own personalities, and let's have a conversation. I just find it was rude that I was interrupted when we're having a really good philosophical discourse here. That's what I'm saying.
Can we look at technical? We're going to continue with this discussion. Dr. Harris and Dr. Mati are going to be brought in, and I appreciate Dr. Mati trying to bring us in, bring you in, and then the audience. But please go ahead.
So it's a narrow argumentative point. I'm not going to take sides either way in this, but I felt, Eden started off by presenting an argument that ostensibly is an argument about evil. And then Muhammad came in and said, you denied evil.
Objectively, a substratum.
Okay, and you said actually there's just good and there's a lack of good. So
Yeah.
is the good something that admits of degree, so you can have greater or lesser good?
Yes.
But then the argument still goes through, because all that's needed for the argument to go through is for you to have less good. So
With all due respect, I think
so the notion of evil is a dead herring. That's not how the argument works.
What my point in response to that was that evil doesn't have an ontological status. You cannot put it, it's not substratum, you cannot put it under a microscope. I'm not making a point about the relational type of evil. You can say that evil exists. I'm saying as an atheist, how can you substantiate, my question was, how can you substantiate the existence of something on atheism objectively, which doesn't have...
But that's irrelevant to his argument.
No, I think it's very relevant.
No, it's not.
If he's denying God's existence on the basis...
All he needs for his argument to work is if good can admit of degrees. If you can have a greater or a lesser amount of good, then the argument's a sound argument.
Now, I feel like it's 3-on-1 now, but no problem. 3-on-2, you need to do this, I'm sure you do. No, it's fine, it's fine.
You're a big man.
No, it's fine, big man, I will have it. But what I'm saying is this, you've negated one very important thing, okay, which is the fact that we talked about divine wisdom anyway, which is that divine wisdom is not mentioned in Epicurean types of evil
This
arguments.
is all irrelevant. It's irrelevant to the logic of the argument.
Excuse me, it's not mentioned in the dilemma.
I'm not asking about
It's
that.
not mentioned even in his argument, because divine wisdom in the Arabic language means wada shaykh makani side. Basically, it's appropriacy. What are you laughing at?
This is all
What's funny
irrelevant
here?
to the argument.
What's funny here?
You aren't answering
Why are you
the
laughing
question
for?
about the argument.
No, hold on. You're laughing. Why are you laughing for?
Because you are deflecting.
No, I'm not deflecting. I'm answering your question. My question is this. When you talk about God, you're talking about all of the attributes that Muslims speak about when we talk about God, including but not limited to the wisdom of God. Now I'm saying that the existence of evil doesn't negate the wisdom of God, because wisdom is appropriacy. It could be appropriate, unless you want to say it's fundamentally inappropriate, for there to be a world in which evil exists, and that's appropriate because, as Hamza also was saying, you know only the pixel and God knows the picture. Do you have the totality of knowledge? You don't know everything that exists. In other words,
and also from a logical perspective, just to address your point, let's assume that so what Muhammad Hijab means about good having levels is in a kind of a model and export into the real world. Good does have levels in the real world, but ontologically, say good is
Non-existent.
good is say it's existent and absolute. Let's assume that, and we have wisdom that's existent and absolute. What we're saying is that evil itself is actually a manifestation of absolute unchanging good and absolute unchanging wisdom, in a real world sense. So even from that perspective, there are theological accounts where you could say, the goodness and wisdom of God actually ground evil in a real world sense, but evil doesn't have its ontological status, is actually good and based on wisdom. That actually undermines the logical argument in my view.
Do you mind if I respond?
And I want a response for that, because there was no laugh, there was like a...
So
it was like, I'm the smart. Thank you. Yeah, it was a good one.
the argument, to be clear, Schellenberg's argument takes divine wisdom into account.
How so?
Okay, so the idea is that prior to God, so let's just put the argument into simplistic terms. The idea is that the theist is committed to three distinct propositions about God. The first is God's unsurpassable greatness. That includes his omniscience, which includes his wisdom, his omnipotence, and his supreme axiological value. Right?
So his omniscience in Islam is different from his wisdom.
Okay, so let's say that also includes his wisdom. Okay. Let's say that part of his superlative brilliance is that it does. Right? The idea is that prior to the existence of any natural world, so the created order, God is independent. This is your point that you want to emphasize, that God is independent of the created order. There's a difference between the creator and the created. Right?
Yes.
So prior to any creation, you have this, all that is existent is a superlative being. And the core argument that Schellenberg puts forward is that the theist is also committed to what he calls prior purity of God. So in other words, there are no goods in God that have any relationship to evil whatsoever. So God is in some sense axiologically unblemished.
Okay.
So he's pure.
Okay.
And the point that he's trying to get across in this new logical argument from evil is trying to say, well, how do you bridge the gap? If you start off with a being that is superbly great, can't be greater, and is axiologically pure in all goodness, there's no evil in God, there's not even anything that presupposes evil. Mm-hmm. So you may even think that there's nothing like courage in God prior to existence. Okay, but let's not be dismissive. I'm trying to give the argument here. So the idea is that from that state, any omniscient and wise being would judge that all the pure goods in him are better than any sorts of finite goods. And the idea of the argument, the thrust of the argument, is that God would model the world after the goods that are in him. In other words, he would make a world that is more God-like.
Okay.
Right. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Okay, so basically in the Islamic tradition, there's different schools of thought. Let me just put it out there, right?
So, gentlemen, I'll let you finish there. We've been given now 7.5 minutes to wrap things up. And I'll let you finish your point.
Let me finish the point. There's different schools of thought. So there's divine, just like in Christianity, like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas and so on. They had this is called theodicy, and in that they had the idea of privation. Okay, Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Qayyim also believed in that. There's divine command theory, which is that something is good because God said it. That's also represented in Islam. There's two ways to answer this question. Let's go with the privation theory for the sake of argument, because there's more than one way to solve this issue. I'm saying the following. I'm saying that, look, if God is all good, it's like, for example, do you see this light over there? You see light, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, so what is goodness is the reflection of the light. Evil is the removal of the light.
Right, okay.
So, you understand. So, good is when God chooses to manifest his attribute of goodness. That is the privation theory of good. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yes,
so, it doesn't require him to have an evil in him to remove the goodness or remove the manifestation of it. Do you understand this?
No, I get it. I get the point. But
that's all.
But then there's the point that the interlocutor gave to you, which is exactly that you can run the same argument. I don't need to talk about, when we can run Schellenberg's argument without talking about evil. We can talk about there exists a world with a distinct absence of good.
Okay, and so what?
In other words, do you see the point? So the point is, the world falls substantially short of God.
No. Look, here's the thing.
Okay.
In the first, you have to answer. You just said
no, that's fine. Let him argue. Let him answer, and then we can take questions.
Because I do get the feel that he spoke for about 3 minutes. I don't say anything.
Give me your answer. I'd like to.
No. So there is a phrase by Imam al-Ghazali, one of the great scholars of Islam. He says that "Laysa fil imkan abda' mimma kan." There's nothing in the creation better than what is. This is kind of connecting what you're talking about. Okay, so there's a long discussion among Islamic scholars about what this means. Do you see what I'm trying to say? So it's because it's connected. So you're coming with good interrogations. I'm not actually dismissing what you're saying. What he's saying is something that Islamic scholars spoke about for 1,000 years. No problem. You're coming with good interrogations. Now the response to that, like Biqai wrote a book on that very phrase. Al-Zabidi, because Al-Ghazali wrote this in Ihya Ulumuddin. Al-Zabidi has a long commentary on
Can
it.
you tell me what the answer that he gave was? Is it possible to tell me what the answer that he gave?
Yes, please. We have to.
Yeah, so I believe that there is a problem with the logic here, yeah? And as I addressed the Professor Harris, what I would say is there is an assumption that there is a distinction between ontological good and a real world evil. Is that correct?
It's not quite what the argument is getting at.
No, so I'm talking about the assumption of the argument. So what you're saying is there is a good, God has goods, right? He's perfect being good, He's omnibenevolent, right? And there is an evil. Are you making an ontological distinction between evil existing and God's goodness?
All right.
What we would say is, in actual fact, evil itself does not have an ontological existence. It is a manifestation of the perfect goodness and the perfect wisdom. So that's the theistic position of Islam. So the whole logic is actually a straw man of Islamic theism. It will only work if you conflate omniscience with God's wisdom, which there is a subtle difference, and there is an assumption in the logic that there is an ontological difference between good and evil itself has some kind of grounding or ontology. We would say that's not the Islamic theistic discourse. The Islamic theistic discourse is God is good.
Excuse me, we've got 1 minute left. 1 minute. Now let me start. I was supposed to have 5 minutes. It's not going to be. Sorry, and you can call me rude. It's fine. I live with that. What I'm saying.
I'm not going. You're a very passionate person.
I'm going to start with the gentleman outside. It strikes me how we all been talking about God, truth, morality. There are men getting cold outside. It's very cold. Workers, working class people.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, no, I'm telling you that.
Okay, thank you.
So let me see, when we speak about God, morality, where do they fit in? That man told me, we need to be out by 1 minute, so I'm not even going to finish.
Okay, let's
he
go.
said, no, really,
Okay,
we need to leave people, because these people needed to ask questions. But because you have 4 men who are truly interested only in themselves, with their truth, with their correctness, you could have been more humble in the Islamic tradition.
How do you know that? I'm interested in myself.
No, because you've been speaking all alone. So what
That's
I'm
an
asking,
assumption.
no,
I'm interested in the truth. I'm interested in the truth.
we need to leave. It's finished.
Thank you.